Hello and welcome. In this series, we embark on a journey to understand one of the most fundamental and often most controversial aspects of American life: taxes.
Disclaimer: this video is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional legal, financial, or tax advice. I am not a certified public accountant, CPA, or a tax attorney. You should consult with a qualified professional for advice tailored to your individual situation. Tax laws are complex and subject to change. The creator of this video or the channel will not be held liable for any actions taken based on the information provided.
But we won't be navigating the complex maze of tax forms or debating current policy. Instead, we will explore the very idea of taxes, the philosophy, the history, and the deep-seated emotions they evoke, through the lens of 7 famous quotes that have captured the nation's sentiments for centuries. From the founding of the country, the relationship between the American people and taxation has been a complicated one. It is, in many ways, the central paradox of our democracy. We demand services, infrastructure, and protection from our government, yet the very mechanism that funds these essentials is often met with suspicion and resentment. This tension is woven into the fabric of our history, beginning with a famous act of protest in Boston Harbor over a tax on tea. It's a story of a constant negotiation between individual liberty and collective responsibility. To begin our exploration, we must start with the most famous quote of all, a statement so ingrained in our culture that it has become a universal truth. It comes from one of America's most brilliant and practical minds, a scientist, inventor, diplomat, and founding father, Benjamin Franklin. In a letter written in 1789, just after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Franklin observed, "Our new Constitution is now established and has an appearance that promises permanency, but in this world nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes." Let's unpack that. At first glance, it seems like a cynical, almost weary statement. Franklin, in his wisdom, pairs the inevitability of paying the government with the ultimate inevitability of life itself, our own mortality. Both are inescapable. Both are absolute. For many, this is where the analysis ends. The quote is used as a common complaint, a shared sigh of resignation every April as tax season reaches its peak. It's a shorthand way of saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it. But to truly understand Franklin's words, we have to look at the context. He wrote this not in a moment of frustration, but in a moment of profound hope and cautious optimism. The United States had just accomplished something extraordinary. It had created a new form of government, a republic designed to last. Franklin's statement wasn't just about the burden of taxes. It was about the permanence of the new nation. What makes a government permanent? What allows it to function, to grow, and to endure? According to Franklin, a key component was a reliable source of revenue. He understood that for the grand American experiment to succeed, for the Constitution to be more than just words on paper, the government needed the resources to operate. It needed to fund an army for defense, build roads and ports for commerce, and pay the salaries of its public servants. Taxes were not just an annoyance, they were the lifeblood of the new republic. By equating taxes with death, Franklin elevates them from a mere financial transaction to a fundamental condition of organized society. Death is the great equalizer in nature. It comes for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. In a similar vein, Franklin is suggesting that taxes are the great equalizer in a functioning civilization. They are the shared contribution that all citizens must make to partake in the benefits of a stable and secure nation. It is the price of admission to a society governed by laws, not by chaos. This perspective is profoundly different from the anti-tax rhetoric that often dominates public discussion. Franklin wasn't just complaining. He was making a deeply philosophical point about the social contract. In exchange for a portion of our earnings, we receive the benefits of a structured society. Roads we can travel on, laws that protect our property, and a military that secures our borders. Without taxes, these things would cease to exist, and the permanency of the nation he was so proud of would crumble. So while the quote is often used to express a negative sentiment, its core meaning is rooted in a practical understanding of governance. It's a recognition that civilization has costs. The certainty of taxes is the certainty of a functioning government. It is the certainty of order, of infrastructure, of a shared system that, in theory, works to benefit everyone. As we move through the coming chapters, we will see how this foundational idea has been challenged, reinterpreted, and debated. But it all begins here, with Franklin's simple, powerful, and enduring observation. He reminds us that our obligations as citizens are as certain as our own existence. and that the society we build together requires a constant investment from all of us. This quote is not one of despair, but one of profound realism about what it takes to build and maintain a nation. In our last chapter, we were left with Benjamin Franklin's profound and enduring statement: "In this world nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes." We explored this not as a complaint, but as a recognition of a fundamental reality: that a stable, permanent nation requires a steady, reliable source of revenue from its citizens. Franklin's words were written in a moment of optimism, as the new U.S. Constitution promised a lasting republic. But a philosophical ideal is one thing, putting it into practice is another entirely. The certainty of taxes would soon face its first great test, not on the battlefield against a foreign power, but in the hills and farmlands of western Pennsylvania. To pay the significant debts incurred during the Revolutionary War, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a federal tax on a domestic product, distilled spirits. In 1791, Congress passed the excise tax, which became known simply as the whiskey tax. On the surface, it seemed logical. The government needed money, and whiskey was a popular, non-essential good. But Hamilton and the legislators in the eastern cities failed to understand what whiskey meant to the farmers on the western frontier. For these farmers, separated from the commercial centers of the East by the Appalachian Mountains, whiskey was not just a beverage. It was a lifeline. Transporting bulky sacks of grain like rye and corn across the mountains was difficult and expensive. Distilling that grain into whiskey made it far more compact, portable, and profitable. In a cash-poor economy, whiskey often served as a form of currency itself, a medium of exchange used to barter for goods and services. To these frontiersmen, the federal tax felt less like a national contribution and more like a direct assault on their livelihood. Furthermore, the tax was structured in a way that favored large, commercial distillers in the East over the small, independent farmers in the West. It was seen as a law made by wealthy Eastern elites to enrich themselves at the expense of the common man. The parallels to the British taxes they had just fought a war to escape were not lost on them. The cry of taxation without representation was replaced by a cry against a tax that felt deeply unfair and discriminatory. The philosophical concept of funding a republic was colliding with the harsh reality of economic survival. Resistance started immediately. At first, it took the form of petitions and peaceful protests. But as the federal government persisted, the opposition escalated. Federal tax collectors were intimidated, threatened, and in some notorious cases, tarred and feathered. The situation grew more volatile, culminating in 1794 in what is now known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Armed insurgents attacked the home of a tax inspector, and thousands of rebellious farmers gathered, threatening to march on Pittsburgh. This was the first major crisis for the new government under the Constitution. It was a direct, armed challenge to the federal government's authority to enforce its own laws. How would President George Washington respond? If the government backed down, it would set a dangerous precedent, showing that any unpopular law could be overturned with threats and violence. The permanency Franklin had hoped for would be undermined, and the United States might fracture before it even truly began. President Washington, a man who valued order and the rule of law above all, made a decisive choice. After attempts at negotiation failed, he invoked his authority as commander-in-chief. He assembled a militia force of nearly 13,000 men from several states, an army larger than the one he had often commanded during the Revolution. And in an unprecedented move, the sitting president personally led the troops into the field to quell the uprising. The sheer size and determination of the federal force had its intended effect. As the militia marched into western Pennsylvania, the rebellion dissolved without a major battle. The leaders were arrested, and the authority of the federal government was asserted in dramatic fashion. Washington's actions sent a clear and powerful message to the entire nation. The laws of the United States would be enforced. The certainty of taxes was no longer just an idea. It was now backed by the full might of the federal government. The Whiskey Rebellion is a crucial chapter in the American story of taxation. It demonstrated the immense difficulty in balancing the needs of the nation with the concerns of its individual citizens. It revealed the deep economic and cultural divides that existed in the young country. But most importantly, it established a vital precedent. It affirmed that for the social contract to work, for the republic to survive, the government must have the power to levy and collect taxes. The debate over fairness and the methods of taxation would continue, and indeed it still does today. But the fundamental principle, that the government had the right to tax its people to ensure its own survival and functionality, was cemented. The price of the republic, it was decided, had to be paid. In our first chapters, we established the foundation of American taxation. We began with Benjamin Franklin's stoic acceptance of taxes as an inevitable certainty, as fundamental as death itself. Then we witnessed this principle put to the test during the Whiskey Rebellion, where the young federal government used decisive force to prove that its authority to tax was not merely a suggestion, but the law of the land. The lesson from those early days was clear. Taxes were the necessary and non-negotiable price for a functioning republic. This view, however, paints taxation as a burden to be endured for the sake of basic order. But what if we looked at it from a different angle? What if taxes were not just the price to avoid chaos, but the investment required to build a truly great society? This shift in perspective marks a significant evolution in American thought, and it is captured perfectly in our second famous quote. It comes from a man who witnessed more of America's turbulent growth than almost anyone. A Civil War veteran, a renowned legal scholar, and one of the most influential Supreme Court justices in history, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. In a 1927 court decision, Holmes wrote a simple, yet powerful sentence: "Taxes are what we pay for civilized society." This statement is profoundly different from Franklin's. Where Franklin's quote speaks of inevitability and resignation, Holmes's speaks of a transaction, a willing purchase. The wording is deliberate. We are not forced to give up our money. We are paying for something of immense value. This single sentence reframes the entire concept of taxation from a necessary evil into a positive, constructive act. It invites us to ask a crucial question. What exactly is this civilized society that we are purchasing? To understand Holmes's perspective, we have to understand his time. He served on the Supreme Court from 1902 to 1932, a period of massive transformation in America. The nation was shifting from a largely rural, agricultural society to an urban, industrial powerhouse. Cities were exploding in size, factories were churning out new products, and incredible fortunes were being made. But this rapid growth, known as the Progressive Era, came with immense challenges. Cities were overcrowded, sanitation was poor, working conditions in factories were often dangerous, and child labor was common. The idea of civilized society was expanding. It was no longer enough for the government to simply provide an army and enforce basic laws, as was the primary focus in Franklin's time. A modern, industrial nation required more. It needed public schools to educate its citizens. It needed sewer systems and public health departments to prevent the spread of disease. It needed regulations to ensure food and medicine were safe. It needed parks and libraries to enrich public life. It needed a government that could address the complex social and economic problems that came with industrialization. This is the civilized society Holmes was talking about. He understood that these public goods, the very things that make a society safe, healthy, educated, and prosperous, do not appear out of thin air. They must be built, maintained, and funded. And the mechanism for that funding is taxation. From this viewpoint, a tax bill is not a penalty. It is a receipt for your share of a functioning, modern world. Your tax dollars help pay for the roads you drive on, the schools your children attend, the firefighters who protect your home, and the scientific research that leads to life-saving discoveries. By serving in the Civil War, Holmes had seen firsthand the ultimate cost of a society falling apart. He understood that civilization is fragile and requires constant, collective effort to maintain. His famous quote is a direct reflection of this belief. It's a concise and elegant expression of the social contract in the modern age. It argues that we as individuals pool our resources through taxes to create a society that is better, safer, and more opportunity-rich than any one of us could build on our own. Comparing Franklin and Holmes reveals a fundamental evolution in the American identity. Franklin's quote reflects the mindset of a new nation focused on survival and stability. It's about establishing the basic price of entry for a functional government. Holmes's quote, written over 130 years later, reflects the ambitions of a confident, growing nation. It's about aspiring to something more than mere survival. It's about using our collective wealth to actively build a better, more just and more civilized world. This idea, that taxes are a proactive tool for social progress, would become the philosophical underpinning for many of the most significant government programs of the 20th century. Welcome back. In our previous chapter, we explored Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s transformative idea that taxes are what we pay for civilized society. This presented a more aspirational view of taxes, not as a mere burden, but as a proactive investment in public goods like schools, sanitation, and safety regulations. But this grand vision of a more civilized society required a financial engine far more powerful than anything the United States had possessed before. For the first 125 years of its history, the federal government was funded primarily by tariffs, taxes on imported goods, and excise taxes on specific products, like the whiskey that sparked a rebellion. This system had two major problems. First, it was volatile, depending entirely on the flow of international trade. Second, and more importantly, many saw it as deeply unfair. Tariffs and excise taxes are regressive, meaning they disproportionately affect the poor and middle class, who spend a larger percentage of their income on consumer goods. During the late 19th century, a period known as the Gilded Age, this disparity became impossible to ignore. Industrialists and financiers built unimaginable fortunes, creating a level of wealth inequality never before seen in America. Yet these titans of industry often paid very little in federal taxes, while a farmer buying tools or a family buying sugar paid a significant portion of their income through hidden taxes on those goods. This growing inequality sparked a powerful political backlash. Populist and progressive movements gained traction, arguing for a fundamental change. They championed a new, more equitable idea: a tax based not on what you buy, but on what you earn. The principle was simple: those with a greater ability to pay should contribute a larger share. This idea was not entirely new. A temporary income tax had been used to fund the Civil War, but an attempt to introduce a peacetime income tax in 1894 was struck down by the Supreme Court. In the case Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the court ruled that a federal income tax was a direct tax and was therefore unconstitutional unless it was apportioned among the states according to population, a logistical and political impossibility. For the advocates of tax reform, the path was clear. If the Constitution stood in the way, then the Constitution itself had to be changed. The fight for a constitutional amendment was long and arduous, but the idea's time had come. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt championed the concept of a graduated tax, where the tax rate increases as income rises. In a 1906 message to Congress, he stated his belief in the need for a tax system that addressed the massive fortunes being accumulated. Finally, in 1909, Congress passed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. It was ratified by the states and became law in 1913. Its text is short, but its power is immense. It reads, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." This was more than just a new law. It was a fundamental shift in the relationship between the American citizen and the federal government. For the first time, the government had the constitutional authority to directly tax the earnings of individuals and corporations. This new power was the financial key that unlocked the 20th century. It provided the revenue for the United States to navigate 2 world wars, to create the social safety nets of the New Deal, to build the interstate highway system, and to fund the scientific research that would put a man on the moon. The initial income tax was incredibly modest by today's standards. In 1913, the top tax rate was only 7%, and it applied only to those with incomes over $500,000, an astronomical sum at the time. In fact, less than 1% of the population was even required to pay. But the principle had been established. The federal government now had a scalable source of revenue tied directly to the nation's economic prosperity. The 16th Amendment was the practical answer to the philosophical vision of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. It created the financial machinery necessary to build and sustain a complex, modern, and civilized society. It also made Benjamin Franklin's certainty of taxes a much more direct and personal reality for millions of Americans in the decades to come. The era of the tax form, the deduction, and the annual April deadline had begun. Welcome back. Our journey so far has taken us from the philosophical foundations of taxation to the monumental creation of the federal income tax with the 16th Amendment. We've seen how the idea of taxes evolved from a necessary certainty for a nation's survival, as Benjamin Franklin saw it, to an active investment in a civilized society, as Justice Holmes articulated. The income tax provided the powerful engine needed to fund this expanding vision of a modern America. But in doing so, it created a new annual ritual for the American citizen, a direct and personal encounter with the machinery of government. And with that ritual came a new, and often overwhelming challenge: complexity. This brings us to our third quote, a statement that perfectly captures the bewilderment many people feel when facing their tax forms. What makes this particular observation so powerful is the person who said it. It wasn't a politician or an economist, but arguably the most brilliant scientific mind of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. After becoming an American citizen, the man who unlocked the secrets of the universe and gave us the theory of relativity famously declared, "The hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax." Let that sink in. The genius who could comprehend the relationship between energy, mass, and the speed of light, who could envision the curvature of space-time, expressed sincere difficulty in understanding the American system of taxation. The quote is often repeated with a sense of humorous relief. If Einstein struggled with it, then it's perfectly acceptable for the rest of us to feel confused and intimidated. But beneath the humor lies a profound commentary on the nature of the system that the 16th Amendment created. Why is the income tax so difficult to understand? Unlike the laws of physics, which are consistent and logical, the tax code is a human creation. It is not a single, coherent document designed from scratch. Instead, it is a sprawling accumulation of laws, amendments, regulations, and court rulings layered on top of one another for more than a century. Every layer was added with a specific purpose, but the end result is a structure of staggering complexity. A primary reason for this complexity is that the tax code evolved from being a simple tool for raising revenue into a powerful instrument for shaping public policy. Congress began to use the tax system to encourage or discourage certain behaviors, a practice often called social engineering. For example, the government wanted to encourage homeownership, so it created the mortgage interest deduction. It wanted to support charitable work, so it made donations tax deductible. It wanted to ease the financial burden on parents, so it introduced credits and exemptions for children. Each of these goals, while perhaps noble on its own, adds a new set of rules, definitions, and exceptions to the code. What qualifies as a charity? What are the limits on the mortgage deduction? Who can be claimed as a dependent? The answers to these questions require pages and pages of detailed regulation. Furthermore, the tax code is used as a primary lever for economic policy. To stimulate the economy, politicians might enact tax cuts. To encourage business investment, they might create complex depreciation rules. To promote certain industries, they might offer special tax credits. These provisions are the result of intense political negotiation and compromise, often leading to loopholes and special rules that benefit specific groups. The result is a system that is not always perceived as fair or logical, but rather as a product of political horse trading. Einstein's frustration highlights a fundamental difference between natural law and man-made law. The universe, for all its complexity, operates on a set of elegant and internally consistent principles. The tax code, on the other hand, reflects the messy, often contradictory, and ever-changing priorities of a society. It is a living document that reflects a century of political debates, economic theories, and social aspirations. So when Einstein called the income tax the hardest thing to understand, he wasn't just making a clever joke. He was making a sharp observation. He was pointing out that this system, created to fund our civilized society, had become a civilization unto itself, with its own arcane language, its own baffling logic, and its own class of experts required to interpret it. The certainty Franklin spoke of was no longer just about the obligation to pay, but also about the bewildering obligation to navigate this labyrinth of rules each and every year. Welcome back. We have journeyed from the certainty of taxes to their role in building a civilized society, and then to their staggering complexity, which Albert Einstein famously called the hardest thing in the world to understand. This complexity creates a natural consequence. When faced with a system of bewildering rules that directly impacts one's personal finances, the logical human response is to try to navigate those rules to one's best advantage. This raises a fundamental question. Does a citizen have a duty to pay as much as possible to support the nation? Or do they simply have a duty to follow the law as written, no matter the outcome? This question was addressed in a landmark judicial opinion that has become the bedrock of modern tax planning. The words come from one of the most respected and influential American judges of the 20th century, Learned Hand. In a 1934 case, Judge Hand wrote an opinion that drew a clear line in the sand regarding a citizen's obligation to the government's treasury. He stated, "Anyone may so arrange his affairs that his taxes shall be as low as possible. He is not bound to choose that pattern which will best pay the treasury. There is not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes." This is one of the most significant statements ever made about the nature of taxation in a free society. It is a powerful defense of the individual against the state. Judge Hand is not advocating for cheating or dishonesty. Rather, he is making a critical legal distinction that is essential to understanding the American tax system. The difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal. It involves deliberately misrepresenting facts, hiding income, or falsifying records to avoid paying what the law says you owe. It is an act of fraud, and it is a crime. Tax avoidance, on the other hand, is the subject of Judge Hand's opinion. It is the practice of using legal means and following the rules as they are written to reduce your tax liability. This can involve anything from contributing to a tax-deferred retirement account, to taking legitimate business deductions, to making charitable contributions. Judge Hand's ruling affirms that engaging in these legal strategies is not only a right, but it is free from any moral or patriotic judgment. You are not a bad citizen for minimizing your tax bill within the legal framework. Your only obligation is to the letter of the law. This principle is a direct consequence of the complexity that Einstein lamented. A tax code filled with thousands of pages of rules, deductions, credits, and exemptions is not just a set of commands. It is also a set of opportunities. Every deduction or credit was placed in the tax code by Congress to encourage a specific behavior, to incentivize homeownership, charitable giving, business investment, and so on. In Judge Hand's view, a citizen who takes advantage of these incentives is not subverting the system. They are participating in it exactly as it was designed. However, this legally sound principle creates a deep philosophical tension when placed next to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s idea that taxes are what we pay for civilized society. If everyone is legally entitled to arrange their affairs to pay the absolute minimum, what happens to the collective enterprise of building that society? This is the heart of the perennial American debate over tax loopholes and fairness. One person's legitimate tax planning strategy is another person's unfair loophole. Judge Hand's opinion essentially frames taxation as a game. The government writes the rules, and the citizen's objective is to play the game to win, using any legal move available. There is no spirit of the law that you are required to follow, only the literal text. This view has had a profound impact, creating a massive industry of tax professionals, accountants and lawyers, whose entire purpose is to help individuals and corporations navigate that complex rulebook and pay as little as legally required. So, while Franklin established the certainty of taxes, and the Whiskey Rebellion established the government's power to collect them, Judge Learned Hand established the right of the citizen to legally minimize them. He separated the legal obligation to pay from any moral or patriotic obligation to contribute. This places the burden squarely back on the government. If policymakers believe certain outcomes are unfair, it is their responsibility to change the rules of the game, not to question the patriotism of those who are simply playing by them. Welcome back. Our last chapter left us in a world defined by legal pragmatism. We explored Judge Learned Hand's landmark opinion, which established that any citizen may legally arrange their affairs to pay as little tax as possible, and that there is not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes. This principle solidified tax planning as a legitimate practice and framed the system as a legal game between the citizen and the state. But a purely legal definition of duty often fails to capture the public's sense of fairness and shared responsibility. What happens when legal actions are perceived as morally questionable, especially during a time of national crisis? This brings us to our next major voice, a leader who faced the monumental task of guiding the nation through its darkest economic hour. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the architect of the New Deal, was confronted with the dual challenges of the Great Depression and the need to fund a massive expansion of government services. He believed that the success of his recovery programs depended on a sense of shared sacrifice. Yet he saw many of the wealthiest citizens using sophisticated and often newly invented legal methods to avoid paying their share. In a 1937 message to Congress, Roosevelt directly confronted this issue, seeking to close the very loopholes that Judge Hand's philosophy had defended. In doing so, he reframed the entire debate, moving it from the courtroom to the court of public opinion. He declared that the problem of tax avoidance was not just a technical one, stating, "Here is a 90% moral issue, and only a 10% legal issue." With this single, powerful phrase, FDR launched a direct assault on the purely legalistic view of taxation. He was in essence speaking directly back to Judge Hand. While Hand's world was one of legal rights and obligations, Roosevelt's was one of moral duties and civic responsibilities. He argued that while these elaborate tax avoidance schemes might technically be legal, they were a profound moral failure. They violated the unwritten social contract and undermined the very idea of a society built on fairness. To understand the power of Roosevelt's words, we must remember the context of the 1930s. The nation was reeling. Unemployment was rampant. Families were losing their farms and homes.
Disclaimer. This video is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional legal, financial, or tax advice. I am not a certified public accountant, CPA, or a tax attorney. You should consult with a qualified professional for advice tailored to your individual situation. Tax laws are complex and subject to change. The creator of this video or the channel will not be held liable for any actions taken based on the information provided.
And the gap between the suffering of the many and the insulated wealth of the few felt like a gaping wound. FDR's New Deal programs, Social Security, public works projects, rural electrification, were designed to alleviate this suffering and rebuild the nation. These programs required immense funding, which came from a tax system with very high top marginal rates. Roosevelt argued that when a wealthy individual used a complex loophole, like creating a foreign corporation to shelter income or setting up multiple family trusts to split fortunes, they were not just making a smart financial decision. They were, in his view, deserting the national community in its time of need. He famously stated that such practices meant more taxes on the rest of us. This was a brilliant political stroke. It transformed the dry, technical subject of tax law into a simple and compelling moral drama. The honest, hard-working American versus the wealthy, clever tax dodger. This perspective was a direct challenge to the idea that taxation is just a game. For Roosevelt, it was the lifeblood of a nation fighting for its survival. He was re-injecting the spirit of the law that Judge Hand's opinion had so carefully dismissed. He was making an appeal to patriotism, arguing that a true patriot does not look for ways to shirk their responsibility, but rather contributes willingly to the common good. FDR's stance represents a pivotal moment in the American conversation about taxes. It cemented the idea that tax policy is not just about economics. It is deeply intertwined with our values and our vision for society. He successfully used moral rhetoric to build public support for a more progressive and robust tax system. The ongoing political debates we hear today about the wealthy paying their fair share are direct descendants of the arguments Franklin D. Roosevelt made in the heart of the Great Depression. He insisted that our obligations to one another, especially in difficult times, must transcend the mere letter of the law. Welcome back. In our last chapter, we were in the midst of the Great Depression, listening to President Franklin D. Roosevelt framed the payment of taxes as a moral and patriotic duty. His argument was that in a civilized society, especially during a crisis, those with the means to contribute must do so to support the common good. This philosophy, that a larger, more active government funded by a progressive tax system is a force for social progress, dominated American political thought for nearly half a century. But by the late 1970s, the nation was facing a new kind of crisis, and a powerful new voice was about to challenge that long-held consensus. The economic landscape was bleak. The country was caught in a vicious cycle of stagflation, a term coined to describe the painful combination of high unemployment, high inflation, and stagnant economic growth. There was a growing sense among many Americans that the government itself, with its high taxes and burdensome regulations, had become part of the problem. This sentiment would find its champion in Ronald Reagan, who, upon taking office in 1981, offered a diagnosis that was a radical departure from the politics of the New Deal. In his first inaugural address, he made a statement that would define an era. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. This single sentence represented a seismic shift in American political philosophy. For decades, the prevailing view was that the government was the primary tool for solving society's problems. Reagan turned this idea on its head. He argued that the engine of progress was not the government, but the individual, the entrepreneur, the worker, the investor. And in his view, the federal government, funded by an oppressive tax system, was standing in the way of that progress. This philosophy was rooted in a school of thought known as supply-side economics. The core idea was a direct challenge to the New Deal model. Instead of the government spending more money to stimulate demand, supply-siders argued that the government should cut taxes to stimulate supply. The theory was that high tax rates, which at the time could be as high as 70% on the top income bracket, punished success and discouraged work, saving, and investment. Why work an extra hour if the government was going to take most of your additional earnings? Why risk starting a new business if a large portion of your potential profits would be taxed away? Reagan's solution was simple and direct: cut taxes. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 was a sweeping piece of legislation that significantly lowered income tax rates for individuals and corporations. The goal was to leave more money in the hands of the private sector. The belief was that this would unleash a wave of economic activity. Individuals would work and save more. Businesses would invest in new factories and technologies. This renewed growth would create jobs and ultimately benefit everyone, leading to a stronger, more prosperous nation. Critics famously dubbed this trickle-down economics, but for its proponents, it was about unleashing the power of the free market. This was a fundamentally different vision of a civilized society than the one offered by Justice Holmes or FDR. In Reagan's view, a civilized society was not one defined by the size of its government programs, but by the extent of its individual freedom and economic opportunity. Taxes were not a benevolent investment in the common good. They were a burden, a necessary evil at best, and a drag on prosperity at worst. He famously joked that the government's view of the economy was, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. The Reagan Revolution represented a full-throated rejection of FDR's moral argument. Where Roosevelt saw tax avoidance by the wealthy as a moral failure, Reagan and his supporters saw high tax rates as a government failure. The problem wasn't unpatriotic citizens. The problem was a tax system that was fundamentally hostile to the creation of wealth. This ideological clash between Roosevelt and Reagan defines the central political debate about taxes in America that continues to this day. On one side is the belief that taxes are a collective investment in a just and equitable society. On the other is the belief that taxes are an impediment to individual liberty and economic growth. Nearly every tax debate in modern American politics can be understood as a battle between these two competing philosophies. Welcome back. In our last two chapters, we explored the great ideological war over American taxation, a battle of competing philosophies that define the second half of the 20th century. On one side, Franklin D. Roosevelt championed taxes as a moral duty to fund a collective, compassionate society. On the other, Ronald Reagan saw high taxes as an oppressive force that stifled the individual freedom and economic growth that truly defined a prosperous nation. This clash of grand ideas sets the stage for our political debates. But when it comes to the actual, practical process of writing tax laws, a more cynical and perhaps more realistic principle often takes over. This brings us to our next piece of wisdom. It isn't from a formal judicial opinion or a presidential address, but from the world of political folklore. It's a simple rhyme that perfectly captures the messy reality of tax legislation, often attributed to the long-serving and powerful chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Russell B. Long. The saying goes, "Don't tax you, don't tax me. Tax that fellow behind the tree." This short, memorable verse is a masterclass in political science. It explains with brutal honesty the core challenge of funding a democratic government. The public simultaneously desires two things that are in direct conflict. They want the benefits of government spending, from roads and schools to defense and social security, but they do not want to see their own taxes go up to pay for them. A politician's career often depends on their ability to navigate this contradiction. The rhyme reveals the simple, pragmatic solution that politics often produces. "Don't tax you" refers to the politician's own constituents, the voters they need to please to stay in office. "Don't tax me" refers to the politician themselves and their key supporters. The solution is to find a third party to bear the cost. That fellow behind the tree. Who is this mysterious fellow? It's anyone who can be taxed without causing a significant political backlash. It might be a small, unpopular minority. It might be a specific industry that has fallen out of public favor. It could be the rich or big corporations, which are often popular targets because they represent a small number of voters. It could even be future generations, through the use of deficit spending. The key is that the fellow behind the tree is a group with less political power to fight back than the groups being protected. This principle is the primary reason the tax code has become the complex labyrinth that Albert Einstein found so baffling. The process of writing a tax bill in Congress is not a clean academic exercise. It is a sprawling, chaotic negotiation. Every line of the tax code is a potential battleground. Lobbyists representing countless industries and interest groups descend on Washington to ensure that their particular fellow is not the one behind the tree. They fight for special deductions, credits, and exemptions. The final tax bill is rarely a reflection of a single, coherent philosophy, whether it's Roosevelt's or Reagan's. Instead, it's a patchwork quilt of compromises, a collection of special deals and targeted provisions stitched together to secure enough votes to pass. A tax break for a specific industry is added to win the vote of a senator from that state. A special credit is included to please a key demographic. The result is a system that often seems to lack any overarching logic, because it wasn't designed for logic. It was designed for political survival. This explains the existence of so many of the so-called loopholes that create public frustration. A provision that one person sees as an outrageous loophole Another sees as a vital and hard-won incentive for their industry or community. The very complexity of the system is a direct result of this endless, piece-by-piece legislative process. The tax code is not a finely tuned machine. It is a sprawling historical document, with each page telling the story of a political battle won or lost. Senator Long's cynical rhyme provides the crucial link between the grand philosophical debates and the frustrating reality of the tax forms we fill out each year. It shows that the real driver of tax policy is often not high-minded ideology, but the simple, powerful, and very human desire to have someone else pick up the check. Welcome back. We have journeyed through the great ideological battles that have shaped American tax policy, from Franklin D. Roosevelt's call for moral contribution to Ronald Reagan's argument that government itself is the problem. Most recently, we were left with Senator Russell B. Long's cynical but truthful rhyme. Don't tax you, don't tax me. Tax that fellow behind the tree. This saying perfectly describes the political engine that creates our tax code. A system built not on coherent philosophy, but on a messy series of compromises designed to protect specific interests. The result is a complex, loophole-ridden code that often feels unfair and incomprehensible to the average citizen. This widespread frustration creates a fertile ground for a powerful political idea: the call to simply tear the whole system down and start over. In the 1990s, this radical notion was championed by a new voice in national politics, magazine publisher and presidential candidate Steve Forbes. He was not a traditional politician, and he offered a solution that was as clear as it was revolutionary. While it's not a single quote, his entire campaign was built on a central, powerful message that can be summarized as: scrap the entire tax code and replace it with a simple flat tax. To drive the point home, Forbes used a brilliant piece of political imagery. He argued that under his plan, the tax return could be so simple it would fit on a postcard. This idea, the postcard tax return, was incredibly appealing. It tapped into the deep-seated frustration that Albert Einstein had voiced decades earlier. It offered a clean, simple, and understandable alternative to the thousands of pages of baffling rules and regulations. What is a flat tax? The concept is straightforward. A true flat tax system has two main components. First, it would eliminate the progressive structure of different tax brackets. Instead, all income, regardless of the amount, would be taxed at a single flat rate. Second, it would eliminate most, if not all, of the deductions, credits, and loopholes that clutter the current system. No more itemizing deductions, no more complex credits, just a simple calculation of income multiplied by a low single rate. The philosophical argument behind the flat tax is a powerful extension of the Reagan-era critique of government. Its proponents argue that the current tax code is not just complex, but it is also a source of massive economic waste and political corruption. Billions of dollars and countless hours are spent every year on tax preparation and compliance. The system of deductions and credits allows politicians to engage in the fellow-behind-the-tree game, rewarding their friends and punishing their enemies. A flat tax, its advocates claim, would solve these problems at a stroke. It would make the system transparent and easy for everyone to understand. It would treat every taxpayer and every dollar of income the same, which is presented as the definition of fairness. By eliminating loopholes, it would end the game of special interests in Washington. And by setting the rate low, it would, according to its supporters, unleash an unprecedented boom of economic growth by encouraging work and investment. This proposal represents a complete rejection of the philosophies that built the 20th century tax system. It rejects Roosevelt's idea that the tax system should be a tool for redistributing wealth and promoting social fairness through progressive rates. It rejects the political horse trading that Senator Long described, because there would be no special breaks to trade. It is, in many ways, the ultimate answer to the citizen who feels powerless against a massive, incomprehensible bureaucracy. However, despite its populist appeal, the flat tax has always faced powerful counterarguments. Opponents argue that it would be a massive tax cut for the wealthy and a tax increase for the middle class and the poor, who currently benefit from lower tax brackets and standard deductions. They argue that it is regressive and would dramatically increase income inequality. Furthermore, critics question whether a rate low enough to stimulate the economy could possibly generate enough revenue to fund the government, potentially leading to massive deficits. This is the core of the debate. Is fairness about everyone paying the same rate, or is it about those with the ability to pay more contributing a larger percentage? The dream of the postcard tax return remains a powerful force in American politics because it speaks to a deep desire for simplicity and fairness. But it has never been implemented at the federal level, in large part because the very political forces it seeks to eliminate the special interests who protect their specific tax breaks, from the home mortgage deduction to charitable contributions, remain as powerful as ever. Welcome back. Our journey has taken us through the epic ideological battles over taxation in America. We've debated whether taxes are a moral duty or an economic burden. We've explored the frustrating complexity of the tax code and the alluring dream of a simple postcard solution. But all of these debates about how to tax the American people are driven by a more fundamental question. How much government are we, as a nation, willing to pay for? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. This brings us to a quote from a man who was at the center of Washington's financial debates for decades. Everett Dirksen was a Republican senator from Illinois, known for his masterful oratory and his pragmatic approach to politics during the mid-20th century. He watched as the federal budget, fueled by Cold War military spending and the creation of major domestic programs, swelled to previously unimaginable sizes. With his characteristic wit, Dirksen made an observation about this new scale of government spending that has been famous ever since. $1 billion here, $1 billion there. And pretty soon you're talking about real money. On the surface, it's a humorous, folksy line. But beneath the humor lies a profound and timeless warning about fiscal policy. Dirksen was speaking to the psychological effect of dealing with numbers so large they become abstract. When Congress begins to casually debate appropriations in the billions of dollars, the connection between that number and the actual earnings of the American people can start to feel distant. $1 billion ceases to be a tangible sum and becomes a kind of political playing chip. Dirksen's quip was a sharp reminder to his colleagues, and to the country, that these were not abstract figures. This was, in fact, real money earned by real people. The historical context for this quote is crucial. Senator Dirksen served during an era of unprecedented government expansion. Following World War II, the United States took on the role of a global superpower, which required maintaining a massive and expensive military. At home, President Eisenhower launched the Interstate Highway System, one of the largest public works projects in history. Then, in the 1960s, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiatives created foundational programs like Medicare and Medicaid, fundamentally expanding the nation's social safety net. All of these programs, many of which remain popular and essential parts of American life, required funding on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before. This is the ultimate fulfillment of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s vision of a civilized society. But civilization on this scale is incredibly expensive. Dirksen's observation highlights the central political tension that defines the modern budgetary process. The same public that dislikes taxes often demands the services that those taxes provide. It is almost always more popular for a politician to promise a new program or a new benefit than it is to propose the tax increase needed to pay for it. This creates a powerful incentive to spend without taxing. The result of this disconnect, of spending $1 billion here, $1 billion there, without a corresponding increase in revenue, is the creation of budget deficits and the accumulation of a national debt. The quote serves as a powerful critique of the tax that fellow behind the tree mentality we discussed in an earlier chapter. When the cost of government is not made clear and transparent to the voters who demand services, it becomes easy for the numbers to spiral upward. We are left in a perpetual debate, not just between the philosophies of Roosevelt and Reagan, but between our own conflicting desires for more government services on one hand, and lower taxes on the other. Senator Dirksen's famous line is not a partisan statement, it's a timeless piece of wisdom about governance. It's a reminder that the vast sums of money that circulate through Washington are not generated by the government itself. They are the collected earnings of a nation of working people, and they must be treated with the respect and seriousness that real money deserves. It forces us to confront the true cost of the government we have built, and to ask whether the services we receive are worth the price we, or future generations, must ultimately pay. Welcome back. In our previous chapter, we were left with Senator Everett Dirksen's timeless observation. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. This quote captured the staggering scale of modern government spending and hinted at the political temptation to fund popular programs without imposing unpopular taxes. This disconnect between what we spend and what we collect in revenue leads directly to one of the most significant and contentious issues in American public life: the national debt. When a government consistently spends more than it takes in, it creates a budget deficit. The national debt is the total accumulation of all these annual deficits, year after year. It represents the total amount of money the federal government has borrowed to meet its obligations. This raises a profound question of fairness that extends beyond our own lives and into the future. This brings us to a quote that is as grim as it is insightful, a bitter piece of irony attributed to President Herbert Hoover. "Blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt." This statement is a dark and powerful twist on a well-known biblical blessing. Instead of inheriting a kingdom or the earth, Hoover prophesied that the next generation's inheritance would be a crushing financial burden. It is a powerful condemnation of fiscal irresponsibility, framing deficit spending not just as an economic issue, but as a moral failing of one generation towards the next. To appreciate the weight of Hoover's words, it's helpful to understand his perspective. As an engineer and a self-made man, he believed deeply in the principles of efficiency and living within one's means. The traditional American view, for most of the nation's history, was that the government, like a prudent household, should not spend more than it earns. A balanced budget was seen as a sign of responsible governance. While temporary debt was acceptable during major crises like a war, the goal was always to pay it back quickly. Persistent, long-term debt was viewed as a sign of national weakness and decay. Hoover's presidency was, of course, overwhelmed by the Great Depression, a crisis that challenged these traditional views and led to the massive expansion of government spending under his successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt. But his warning about the debt remains a core tenet of fiscal conservative thought. The quote brilliantly identifies the ultimate fellow behind the tree we discussed in a previous chapter. When politicians want to spend money without raising taxes on current voters, the easiest solution is to borrow it. Borrowing from the future is politically painless in the present because the people who will have to pay it back, our children and grandchildren, are not yet voting. They are a silent, powerless constituency. Hoover's statement gives a voice to that silent generation, accusing the present of securing its own comfort at the expense of its children's prosperity. The mechanics of this inheritance are straightforward. The debt must be paid back with interest. As the national debt grows, the annual interest payments become a larger and larger portion of the federal budget. This is real money, hundreds of billions of dollars each year, that cannot be spent on other national priorities, whether that's funding scientific research, rebuilding infrastructure, or even cutting taxes for current citizens. It becomes a mandatory, ever-growing mortgage payment on the past. Hoover's grim prophecy has become a central, recurring anxiety in American politics. The numbers have grown far beyond what he could have ever imagined, but the fundamental principle remains the same. The national debt forces us to confront the long-term consequences of the billion here, a billion there. It means the debates we have today about taxes are not just about who pays for the government we have now, but also about who pays for the government we had yesterday, last year, and decades ago. It is a stark reminder that our fiscal decisions create a legacy, and that we have a profound responsibility to ensure that the legacy we leave to the next generation is one of opportunity, not just obligation. Welcome back. Our long journey through the world of American taxes has taken us from the nation's founding principles to the complex political battles of the modern era. We've heard from presidents, judges, and economists. We've grappled with the sheer scale of government spending and the immense weight of the national debt. But after all the grand theories and political philosophies, what is the lived experience for the average citizen? How does this massive, complex, and often intimidating system feel to the person who must navigate it every year? This brings us to a voice that, for many, was the voice of the American people themselves. During the 1920s and 30s, the cowboy philosopher and humorist Will Rogers was one of the country's most beloved figures. With his folksy wisdom and sharp wit, he had a unique ability to cut through the noise and articulate what ordinary people were thinking. As the income tax was becoming an established, and often dreaded, part of American life, Rogers made an observation that was as funny as it was painfully true. The income tax has made more liars out of the American people than golf has. This is a classic Will Rogers one-liner. It's funny, it's relatable, and it carries a powerful sting of truth. The humor works by comparing the very serious business of filing taxes to the common, and mostly harmless, habit of golfers fudging their scores. It's a gentle way of pointing out a not-so-gentle reality, that the tax system itself seems to encourage dishonesty. Rogers was not saying that Americans are inherently dishonest. He was making a subtle but crucial point about the system's effect on human behavior. His career flourished as the income tax grew from a small levy on the very rich into a broader-based tax affecting a much larger portion of the population. He was observing, in real time, the birth of a new national anxiety and a new, adversarial relationship between the citizen and the state's tax-collecting agency, the IRS. What is it about the tax system that creates this temptation? The reasons are woven through the very themes we've been discussing in this series. First, there is the overwhelming complexity that Einstein complained about. When people are faced with a system they cannot fully understand, it can breed resentment and a sense that the game is rigged. It can become tempting to cut a corner here or there, rationalizing it as a way of getting even with a system that feels opaque and unfair. Second, there is the perception that everyone else is doing it. The political reality described by Senator Long, tax that fellow behind the tree, and the legal principle of tax avoidance defended by Judge Hand create a public perception that the wealthy and well-connected are playing by a different set of rules. When people believe that others are not paying their fair share, their own moral commitment to paying theirs can be weakened. Will Rogers's quote captures the erosion of trust that occurs when a system is perceived in this way. It marks the shift from the ideal of taxation as a shared civic contribution, the civilized society of justice homes, to the reality of it being a private, often stressful, and adversarial confrontation with a powerful bureaucracy. For many people, the annual tax filing process does not feel like a patriotic act. It feels like a high-stakes audit where they are presumed guilty until proven innocent. This quote serves as a crucial barometer of public sentiment. It reminds us that the stability of the entire tax system rests on a foundation of voluntary compliance. The government does not have the resources to audit every single citizen every year. It relies on the vast majority of people calculating and paying their taxes honestly. When trust in the fairness and legitimacy of the system declines, so does the willingness to comply. Will Rogers, with his simple, comedic observation, put his finger on a deep and enduring challenge for American democracy. How do you maintain a sense of shared responsibility and civic honesty in a system that is mind-bogglingly complex, politically manipulated, and inherently adversarial? It's a question the nation has been struggling with ever since. Welcome back. We have journeyed through a landscape of deeply held beliefs about taxes in America. We've seen taxes framed as a certainty, a moral duty, a legal game, and an economic burden. We've explored the public's frustration with complexity, captured by Will Rogers's quip about the tax code, making more liars than golf. All of these viewpoints contribute to the perpetual, often heated, political debate. But what if there were a simple way to visualize the central economic challenge that every politician and policymaker faces? This brings us not to a quote, but to a famous drawing, a simple curve sketched on a restaurant napkin that would come to define the modern debate over tax rates. The concept is known as the Laffer curve, named after the economist Arthur Laffer. The story, now a piece of political legend, takes place in 1974, where Laffer was having dinner with two high-ranking government officials, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. To explain his theory, he supposedly grabbed a napkin and drew a simple diagram. That diagram illustrates a powerful idea. Imagine a graph where the tax rate is on the bottom axis, going from 0% on the left to 100% on the right. The vertical axis represents the total tax revenue collected by the government. The curve that Laffer drew was an arc, like an upside-down U. The logic is straightforward. At a 0% tax rate, the government obviously collects zero revenue. But, and this is the crucial insight, at a 100% tax rate, the government would also collect zero revenue. Why? Because if the government confiscated every single dollar a person earned, there would be no incentive for anyone to work or invest.
Disclaimer: this video is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional legal, financial, or tax advice. I am not a certified public accountant, CPA, or a tax attorney. You should consult with a qualified professional for advice tailored to your individual situation. Tax laws are complex and subject to change. The creator of this video or the channel will not be held liable for any actions taken based on the information provided.
Economic activity would grind to a halt. This means that somewhere between 0 and 100%, there must be a tax rate that maximizes the amount of revenue the government collects. The Laffer curve is a theoretical representation of this relationship. It suggests that there are two tax rates that will produce the exact same amount of revenue. One low rate on a large, vibrant economy, and one high rate on a smaller, struggling economy. The explosive political implication of the Laffer curve is what happens on the right side of the arc, a theoretical area that Laffer called the prohibitive range. If a country's tax rates are in this range, they are so high that they are actively discouraging work and investment. In this scenario, the theory holds that cutting the tax rate would actually increase government revenue. By lowering the rate, the government would unleash so much new economic activity, more jobs, more investment, more growth, that the total amount of taxable income would grow by more than enough to offset the lower rate. This simple drawing on a napkin provided the intellectual firepower for the Reagan Revolution we discussed in Chapter 8. It was the core argument behind the supply-side economic theory that cutting taxes could, in effect, pay for itself. It transformed the debate. Tax cuts were no longer presented as a cost to the government, but as a potential benefit to the Treasury. The Laffer curve does not provide easy answers. In fact, its main legacy is in how perfectly it frames the enduring debate. The entire political conflict over tax rates can be seen as an argument about where our country currently is on that curve. Those who advocate for tax cuts often argue that we are on the economically damaging right side of the curve. Those who argue for tax increases, especially on the wealthy, are arguing that we are on the left side of the curve, where rates can be raised to generate more revenue without significantly harming the economy. The truth is, no one knows precisely where that revenue-maximizing sweet spot is. Economics is not a perfect science, and the curve is a concept, not a precise mathematical tool. But its power is in its simplicity. It forces us to acknowledge a fundamental trade-off: the need to fund the government versus the danger of stifling the economic activity that generates the revenue in the first place. The eternal challenge of tax policy is the search for that elusive balance. And so, we come to the end of our journey. For the past 14 chapters, we have explored the vast and contentious landscape of American taxes, not through the lens of spreadsheets and filing instructions, but through the powerful words that have shaped our national conversation. We began with Benjamin Franklin's foundational truth, that in this world nothing is certain except death and taxes. This certainty has been the one constant in a story filled with rebellion, philosophical conflict, and constant change. We witnessed the forceful establishment of that certainty in the hills of Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion. We then saw that certainty imbued with a noble purpose through Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s vision of taxes as the price we pay for a civilized society. This vision was given its financial engine by the 16th Amendment, creating the modern income tax, a system so vast and intricate that it baffled the brilliant mind of Albert Einstein. This complexity created a new set of questions. Is navigating this system a purely legal game, where, as Judge Learned Hand argued, there is no patriotic duty to pay a penny more than the law requires? Or is it, as Franklin D. Roosevelt passionately declared during the Great Depression, a profound moral issue, a test of our commitment to one another in a time of crisis? This central conflict, between tax as a legal calculation and tax as a moral duty, has defined our modern era. It gave rise to the Reagan Revolution, which powerfully argued that the government and its high taxes were not the solution, but the problem itself. It fueled the cynical political reality captured by Senator Russell Long's rhyme, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree." In response to this complexity and political maneuvering, a powerful desire for radical simplicity emerged, embodied by the dream of a flat tax on a postcard. Yet, as Senator Everett Dirksen's observation about $1 billion here, $1 billion there reminded us, the scale of our government is immense. The cost of the civilized society we demand is real, leading to the grim inheritance that Herbert Hoover warned of: a national debt passed to the young. Faced with this system, is it any wonder that the American public has often responded with the cynical skepticism voiced by the humorist Will Rogers? The entire story, including the economic theories visualized by the Laffer curve, is the story of a nation in a perpetual argument with itself. If there is one single thread that ties all of these quotes together, it is the fundamental, unresolved tension at the heart of the American experiment. The conflict between our fierce love of individual liberty and our need for a functional, collective society. We want the freedom to pursue our own success and keep what we earn. We also want the benefits of a strong, stable, and prosperous nation. Safe roads, good schools, a powerful military, and a social safety net. The American tax system, in all its messy, frustrating, and contradictory glory, is the primary battleground where we fight over how to balance these two competing desires. There is no easy answer. The pendulum of public opinion and political power swings back and forth. The conversation about fairness, simplicity, and responsibility never truly ends. Understanding this long history may not make the task of filing our taxes in April any more pleasant, but it can give us a deeper appreciation for the forces that have shaped our country. The tax code is more than just a set of rules for collecting revenue. It is a mirror reflecting our nation's history, its anxieties, its ambitions, and its ongoing, unfinished conversation about who we are and what kind of society we choose to be.
Disclaimer: this video is for informational and educational purposes only, and should not be considered professional legal, financial, or tax advice. I am not a certified public accountant, CPA, or a tax attorney. You should consult with a qualified professional for advice tailored to your individual situation. Tax laws are complex and subject to change. The creator of this video or the channel will not be held liable for any actions taken based on the information provided.